why do you think social sciences in academia is so bad at just cleanly presenting data to people? Is it because they're afraid of what people might do with data, or they're like feel this say? Is it a proprietary sacredness? Is it the desire to get money from people by paywalling all
Mhm.
these articles online, and I have to get around it with Annie's archive? Like, why is academia so bad at doing what you do, when it seems like they should just be doing this stuff?
Right. So I don't think there's just one answer to this question. There's a lot of kind of issues with academia. There's kind of some benefits, but also a lot of costs. I think that the largest problem is that there isn't really an incentive for academics to present their research in kind of an interpretable way, I guess you could say. A lot of papers just aren't really read. People aren't very interested in them, and the incentives in academia are kind of to get tenure, mostly get jobs, and kind of those incentives don't always align to having kind of good quality work, if that makes any sense. I think the second problem is that science in general doesn't seem to replicate very well. And there's kind of a lot of ways you can tell which research will replicate based on like p-values or effect sizes or priors. But I mean, you kind of need background knowledge and some effort to do that. And if there's no kind of incentive to do that, then it just isn't done, I guess. This is um this is a very negative answer, but I don't think there's a solution actually. I think this is kind of something that people have always kind of debated. Is like, okay, science and rationality might be useful, but there's always going to be kind of a certain boundary that humans are never really going to achieve. And I think that's fine. I think there's some kind of nobility to trying to strive to learn what is possible, even when it's kind of difficult. But if like let's say I was the president of Harvard and kind of wanted to force academics to do good research, I think that the number one decision, the kind of easiest decision, would be to force academics to make their data public. I think that's the number one kind of replication mechanism, because if the data is public, then other people can see, okay, are there some kind of coding errors that need to be fixed, and kind of stuff like that. And obviously there's kind of still the problem of kind of selective publishing, that people will publish findings that are more invigorating, that kind of pass certain statistical significance tests and whatnot. But I think that in terms of like a very easy decision that would have a large impact, I think that the obvious one is just making data public. I've heard that argument before, that there's kind of like an incentive in academia to make your language complex, or to use kind of like a formal structure that feels restrictive. Like when I write papers, like I do feel like I'm kind of being restricted a little bit with kind of the way I can say things, but I don't think that's that much of an issue. In comparison to, for example, data not being public, or researchers maybe not having the right incentives. I was saying specifically the English homicide decline cannot be explained with genetics, because the interval is kind of too small. The heritability of criminality isn't that high. And kind of people who are executed are also probably kind of leaving back some children. Um, like the math just doesn't work out, even if you make favorable assumptions. Now, I do think that it's likely that over the course of kind of European history, since kind of the dawn of Christianity, there's kind of been a slow selection towards kind of a more pacifistic, passive kind of human. I do think that's real, but I don't think that it occurred only due to the death penalty. I think there's other factors at play there. So my answer is unfortunately that I honestly don't know. This is kind of an area of human biodiversity and history that I'm not as familiar with. But I have a theory that if you have kind of a social structure, like Christianity, or a state, you kind of have a phenomenon where the people who reproduce will be the people who are conforming to the values of that state. And over time, there will be a genetic drift towards genes that cause the adoption or the practice of those values. So, one quick comment is that I don't think you can explain the rise of European individualism through Christianity concretely. That kind of seems to have deeper genetic and cultural roots than Christianity. But I do think that the rise in kind of more egalitarian morality and kind of the Hajnal mindset, I think that could be explained by Christianity. But my honest answer is that I'm not as familiar with that branch of history. Yeah, I see what you mean. Um, I'm actually quite unfamiliar with the history behind the Protestant Reformation, um, due to some religious background of mine. But it does seem plausible. I guess the story you're saying, it does seem plausible to me that maybe there's kind of some genetic and cultural incompatibilities between Northern Europe and kind of Christianity, which kind of developed in the Middle East. But I can't really comment on it. So what I did was I basically, David Becker, he maintains kind of the National IQ database. I took all of his studies. I collected every single scholastic ability study that has been done internationally. So PISA, PEARLS, TIMSS, kind of the regional African studies. And I just plotted every single country that had a decent amount of data. Um, there was, from what I remember, some European countries are going down recently. The obvious culprit seems to be immigration. Um, so if you look at like Estonia, I'm pretty sure Estonia is actually going up. Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, they're relative to other nations, they're kind of increasing in cognitive ability. It's very difficult to tell how cognitive ability changes across time. Because from what we know from like studies on measurement and variance between cohorts, we know that IQ tests are biased in favor of people who are born recently. And a lot of these increases that are kind of observed, which we call the Flynn effect, right? They're actually mostly artifacts and they don't really represent an increase in intelligence. But it is possible to kind of look at different nations and see who's kind of increasing and decreasing relative to each other. And it seems that Eastern Europe is increasing. And recently, in particular, there's some Western European nations like France and Belgium, I remember in particular, that are decreasing. And the obvious culprit, I think, is immigration. But it's kind of hard to tell.
You're saying that Eastern Europe is increasing despite the supposed brain drain that's going on, where all the smartest
That
things are
is
being sent.
interesting. Yeah. So it seems that these kind of young Eastern European children are actually still doing pretty well in terms of kind of scores on the PISA or TIMSS scholastic tests. And there's kind of arguments about what exactly these tests measure, internationally, especially. I think it's just intelligence. If you kind of plot the national IQs and the scores from these kind of PISA, PEARLS, TIMSS tests, they correlate basically perfectly. I think it's kind of, I think it's a little bit facetious to claim that they're not measuring intelligence. I could believe that maybe there is a bias in favor of certain regions. Like I think you could make the argument that maybe the tests are biased in favor of East Asia, or that maybe these scores in developing countries aren't that reliable or indicative of intelligence. But I think that kind of at the group level, on average, they're pretty good indicators of intelligence. Um, in terms of why the brain drain isn't decreasing intelligence, I think that it might actually be that some of the immigrants just aren't that intelligent. Like from what I gather, a lot of Poles who leave the country aren't like these kind of computer programmers or doctors, but there's like a lot of kind of janitors who leave to go to England to work. If I had to guess, I think that's probably what's behind the lack of a decrease. But it's not something that I've studied in detail, to be honest.
Yeah, one of the things I'd be interested to see as a follow up would, if you could, and I know Denmark might have data on this, but a lot of other countries wouldn't, is if we
Mhm.
were able to disaggregate native test scores from immigrant background test scores.
Oh, yes, yes. This has actually been done. Rinderman did it. He actually just went through all of the kind of the PISA data sets and he plotted the immigrant scores and the native scores. The native scores in European countries are almost always higher, of course. But there's a few outliers like Canada, Australia, and I think it was the UAE that have intelligent immigrants, but otherwise the immigrants tend to be lower in cognitive ability.
That's
Um,
interesting. I was taking a look at the graph here for Australia, and it still
mhm.
found here it
It did
found a
find a
decline.
decrease. I it, I do remember that actually. The p-value was pretty good. I don't really have an answer as to why it's decreasing. I mean, realistically speaking, these changes aren't very large. Like they could plausibly be caused by the environment. Like maybe if people start taking the wrong supplements, foods, like that could shift the kind of the national IQ by a few points.
Hmm.
But admitted, these, I mean, these things have not been researched, so it's kind of hard to make concrete claims, of course.